Welcome to the Rules Committee. It's good to see you.
Good to see you again.
One thing I do think I want to correct is that Chairman Thompson and Vice Chair Cheney never said that the purpose of this was to bring criminal referrals, that the purpose of the investigation was the purpose of the investigation is to get to the truth of the causes and the events constituting the attack on Congress and on the Capitol. So the purpose of this particular action is to coerce compliance by Steve Bannon, who is the only person out there who thinks that he's above the law. Now, but by all means, you can respond to that.
I would suggest using a phrase Mr. Bannon uses quite frequently, catch the signal, not the noise. The signal in the testimony from Chair Thompson and Ms. Cheney referenced criminal contempt and Mr. McCarthy's especially active efforts to block the committee. So I think that the signal they are sending is that that's the direction they want to go.
Catch the signal, not the noise. Okay. Eddie, you started off by saying that we're more concerned, I think, about Steve Bannon's podcast than we are about the truth of January 6th. I didn't know Steve Bannon had a podcast. Apparently,
well, did you listen to the statements of the?
I didn't know that that's where they were drawn from.
He referenced them in his opening.
Well, I knew that Steve Bannon was repeatedly saying on January 5th that all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. We are closing in on the target. He was saying it's unlike anything that you're going to expect, and so on.
Very similar to other political rhetoric.
Okay, fair enough. But here's the point. Let's just speak for real, if we could, Mr. Gaetz.
Only way I do it.
You've been on Steve Bannon's podcast 3 different times.
I think way more than 3.
Okay, at least 3 times that I could find just by Googling it here. So the only person mentioning Steve Bannon's podcast is you.
No, that's not true. The chairman actually mentioned it in his opening.
Okay, then I missed it. He was mentioning statements. He wasn't advertising the podcast or his slogan or whatever. But here's the question I want to ask you. Let's just start with basics. Do you accept that Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election?
I accept that Joe Biden is the president.
Do you accept that he won the election by more than 7 million votes and defeated Donald Trump by 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, a margin that Donald Trump called a landslide when he beat Hillary Clinton by the same numbers?
I think that our election was uniquely polluted by these indiscriminate mail-in ballots. I think that this was the first time in America's history where the mailbox beat the ballot box.
Do you think there's any evidence that there was electoral corruption or fraud that materially altered the outcome of the presidential election, and where is that evidence?
I believe that had mail ballots not been sent to people who had not requested them, that Donald Trump would be sitting behind the Resolute desk.
Okay, but you don't think that there is, legally speaking, I know you're a lawyer because you went to the great law school, William & Mary. Legally speaking, there was no election fraud or no election corruption. Well, let's put it this way. Do you agree that 61 different federal and state courts, including 8 judges that Donald Trump appointed himself to the federal bench, have rejected every claim of electoral corruption or fraud that have been advanced? Do you agree with that?
I don't, and the reason is those claims are not evaluated because in many of the circumstances you reference, jurisdiction was the principal question. So I think it requires a review of the procedure.
Do you have any case authority in the land of those 61 cases or any other cases where a court has determined that there was electoral corruption or electoral fraud that materially affected the outcome of the election in any state in the union?
No court.
Do you have one?
Which I believe is a real failure of the judiciary. I think the Article III courts failed our country by not exercising more jurisdiction over those questions. Now, there's a difference in whether or not fraud existed and whether or not there's an adequate remedy, and I think also a number of those cases were kicked on remedies.
No court has said that fraud existed, and so there's no remedy because there's no violation, Mr. Gaetz.
Right, but you cannot.
There's no violation, there's no fraud.
That there was no fraud if they didn't take up the question and review the facts on jurisdiction or remedy.
You know what? That might work on Steve Bannon's podcast, but that's not going to work in the Rules Committee of the United States House of Representatives. I'm sorry, Mr. Gaetz, forgive me. I've got some serious questions to ask you. The chairman of the January 6th committee, Chairman Thompson, and John Katko, who was the emissary of Kevin McCarthy, negotiated an agreement for an independent outside commission with 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, equal subpoena power, right down the middle. And yet Donald Trump decided he didn't like it because he doesn't want anybody investigating January the 6th. So he turned against it, and then the Republican leadership flipped over and turned against it. I think you voted against that commission. Why did you vote against that commission?
For many of the reasons that I've discussed today, that the focus on January 6th, the
So you don't want to know?
is unwarranted.
You don't want to know anymore?
Look, I think we have.
Okay, let me ask you about that.
We have a process in Article 3 where the courts get to determine those issues. If the United States government brings charges, people can resolve those in the courts.
You don't want to know.
That's not okay with you guys because you want
Mr.
to
Gaetz,
politicize it because you.
I know you too well for this. You don't want to know the answer. You don't want
guys
to know.
don't have an
No, no,
answer
so let
to
me,
the issues
Mr.
affecting
Gaetz, let me
the
ask you. Let me ask you a serious question.
The stenographer is trying to take people's words down, and she can't if everybody talks over each other, so.
Our apologies
You have
to the
yeah,
stenographer.
okay,
We're going to
thank
do
you.
it civilly like two lawyers, okay? Mr. Gaetz, let me ask you this. Let's say that the exact same attack had taken place. Let's assume 145 of our officers were beaten in the face with baseball bats, steel pipes, Confederate battle flags, etc. Let's say they interrupted the counting of electoral college votes for the first time in American history for 4 or 5 hours. Let's say marauders, insurrectionists came into our building and chanted for hanging Vice President Mike Pence. But let's just change the hypothetical. This one element, Mr. Gaetz. Let's say it wasn't the Proud Boys. Let's say it wasn't the Oath Keepers. Let's say it wasn't the 3%ers. Let's say it wasn't the Aryan Nations. Let's say it was Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Would you really not want an investigation into what happened with that attack on America?
If Al-Qaeda or ISIS attacked the U.S. Capitol, I would think that the least capable institution to bring them to justice would be this January 6th committee.
You would not want...
I would far prefer the legal process to play out or the military process to play out. If the American people had to rely on the Congress itself as an institution to protect us from ISIS, without law enforcement, without the military, we would be in deep, deep trouble.
Okay, is that a new position for you and Mr. Jordan? Because I know you guys
it's a
have
new
been involved.
hypothetical.
Yeah, you've been involved in a lot of different investigations, both of you. For example, does Benghazi ring a bell?
I was, I believe, a law student at the Great William and Mary Law School.
All right. Well, but before I come to Mr. Jordan, let me ask you this. Do you think that people who are subpoenaed by a court or by the United States Congress, who think in their head that they might have a privilege or someone else might have a privilege, have the right just not to show up?
I believe that people have the right to allow the legal process to
Okay,
resolve whether
but you know
or not
how
they're
that works, Mr.
obligated
Gaetz.
to
You're a
appear.
lawyer. You know how that
Very
works.
much so.
You
You
show
know how
up.
it works, too.
Wait a second,
You know
Mr.
that-
Gaetz. Wait, hold on. Let's try to educate the public here.
Please.
Because people need to know. If you're subpoenaed, you go. If you think you have a privilege, for example, let's say Steve Bannon says, you know what, I'm guilty as hell. I don't want to testify against myself. In America, you don't have to. The Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination says, I plead the Fifth. I might incriminate myself, but you know what? You got to go. And you got to answer each specific question. Some of them might implicate your Fifth Amendment rights, and some of them might not. Even if he thinks he's got, in some surreal parallel universe, a presidential executive privilege, even though he didn't even work for the White House at that point. He'd been fired by Donald Trump in August of 2017. This is in January of 2021, in December of 2020. But even if he thought that, he's got to come before the committee, and he has to plead it. Do you not agree with that?
I think that...
No, honestly, do you not agree with that?
Mr.
Yeah.
Raskin, I allowed you to speak, and I didn't interrupt you. I hope I'm given the same opportunity.
Just give me the honest answer.
The honest answer is that the McGahn litigation that you and I both followed closely as members of the Judiciary Committee actually is the path forward. McGahn didn't have to show up to assert that he was waiting for legal...
The president
Hold on,
asserted
hold on.
executive
Now
privilege on his
Now
behalf.
you're the one giving challenges to the stenographer. So, yeah,
No,
I
I'm telling you,
on
wait a second. I'm going to elaborate on your answer
No,
here.
but I haven't even given my full answer yet.
That's not how it works in the rules committee, Mr. Gaetz. Just follow this then.
Well, wait,
the president...
do I get to respond to these?
Mr. Gaetz, I'm going to give you the chance to respond.
Well, it doesn't
Respond
sound like it. It sounds like you
President
monologue
Trump
and then
asserted
complain about the
executive privilege.
stenographer if I respond.
President Trump asserted executive privilege for McGahn. President Biden has not
I
asserted...
believe there is.
Has not asserted executive
but
privilege.
President Trump
But-
has initiated litigation. Look, the
So-
reason you all waited on McGahn is because the Russia hoax wasn't going well for you. And the reason you're not
Okay,
waiting
all
now
right.
is because you have no other legislation
Blah, blah,
or no other
blah.
solutions
Okay.
for the country.
All right,
That's why
Mr. Jordan, let me switch
you
to you.
had the McGahn playbook, but you've ditched it because you guys need January 6th so bad.
Okay.
All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us here at Golden State Times. If you're new to the channel, we encourage you to subscribe by clicking that middle button. Also, check out our previous video by clicking the video on the right, or a video you might enjoy by clicking the video on the left. Also, don't forget to click the thumbs up button and share this video on social media. Peace.